Welcome to History to Snooze By. Tonight, we invite you on a quiet journey through time into the heart of memory, silence, and faith. This is the story of one man's long walk to Jerusalem and the life that followed. Before we begin, we gently ask you to support the channel by tapping the like button, subscribing for more calming historical journeys, and leaving a comment below. Let us know what place, time, or story would you like to drift off to next. Now, find a comfortable place to rest. Let the noise of the day fade away. Close your eyes and let your breath slow. The road lies ahead. Let's walk it together. Part 1. The road begins. They say a man can trace the shape of his life from the first road he takes away from home. I have often wondered if that is true. My journey began on a cool morning when the mist still clung to the trees and the fields were soft with dew. The village bell had just finished ringing its morning call when I stepped onto the worn path that led out of the valley and into the world. I remember the scent of tilled earth and smoke from the hearths, the lowing of cattle still resting in their pens, the sleepy hush of a place not yet fully awake. I had walked these paths since I was a child, barefoot and free, chasing chickens or helping my father lift stones from the edge of the barley fields. But that morning, everything felt different. The sky above looked endless. The road beneath my feet no longer looped back home. My mother was the last to hug me. Her hands were dry and warm. She said little, only that God would walk beside me and that I must remember to pray each night. I told her I would. I think I believed it. My father clapped me on the shoulder but did not meet my eyes. He'd already lost a brother to war many years ago, before I was born. He knew the road I was taking was not made only of dust and stone. It was made of blood as well. There were others from our village who marched with me that day. A smith's apprentice named Alan. 2 brothers who bred mules for the neighboring abbey. Old Henri, who had fought as a younger man and now walked with a limp but carried a sword at his side once more. We were a small band, but when we joined the larger host near the cathedral at Rouen, we were swept up in something far greater than ourselves. I was only 19. I had never seen a town larger than ours. Rouen startled me. The streets buzzed with voices, carts creaked under the weight of barrels and grain, and bells rang from towers that seemed to pierce the sky. At the heart of the city, in the square, men stood on raised platforms, preaching with fire in their eyes. They spoke of salvation, of Jerusalem, of the tomb of Christ. They said it had been taken, desecrated, stolen from the faithful, and that we, simple men, farmhands, and blacksmiths, and beggars alike, were called to reclaim it. Not for glory, but for God. It stirred something in me. I was never learned in scripture, but I knew the hymns. I had seen how my mother knelt each night, whispering thanks for the bread on our table. I had heard the stories of Christ's walk to Calvary. When the priest at Rouen placed his hand on my head and marked me with ash, I felt the weight of the cross upon my shoulders. It was not heavy yet. That would come later. We camped outside the city for many nights, waiting for the full host to gather. Tents dotted the fields like a strange harvest. Fires crackled, and songs were sung in every tongue I had ever heard and many I had not. Men from the south, their skin browned by stronger suns. Others from across the sea, fair-haired and sharp-eyed. Some came with horses, others barefoot. Some carried swords passed down through generations. Others held only sharpened sticks and hope. The banners of the lords fluttered in the breeze. Red crosses stitched hastily onto tunics. One morning, we rose to see that the bishops had arrived. Their processions moved slowly, draped in robes of white and gold, carrying relics said to have touched the saints. One of them, it was whispered, bore a splinter of the true cross itself. We fell to our knees as it passed, a silence falling over the crowd like snow. It was during those days that I began to keep a small prayer in my mind. I said it often, not aloud, not always fully formed, but it lived there, a murmur beneath my breath. It was a prayer not for victory, but for the strength to carry on, for a clean heart, for safe passage, for the grace to return someday with my soul intact. We left Rouen at dawn. The sky had turned the color of pearl, pale and soft. Our boots were wrapped tightly, our cloaks heavy with morning damp. The road south stretched far ahead. I looked back only once. The cathedral spire still rose above the city like a finger pointing to heaven. Then the mist swallowed it, and it was gone. The march began in earnest then. Day after day, our feet carried us farther from all we knew. Villages became rarer, and the woods thickened. Streams ran cold and quick over smooth stones, and we filled our flasks in their waters. Sometimes we passed shrines along the path, with crude carvings of the Virgin Mary or Saint Michael. We would pause, cross ourselves, and move on. Food was simple. Flat bread, salted meat, dried apples. Some nights we sang. Some nights we were too tired to do more than eat and sleep. I learned to walk without thinking, to let the road carry me, my eyes fixed on the boots ahead. It was not all hardship. There were moments, even then, of quiet beauty. A morning when the fog parted and the hills ahead looked like waves on a silent sea. A grove of pines where the sunlight dappled the forest floor like scattered coins. The laughter of a young man who had never seen a hedgehog before and tried to chase one with a spoon. These things stay with me more than the sermons or the cries of war. Small things, human things. One evening, near a stream that curved like a ribbon through a wide meadow, I sat beside Alon and asked if he was afraid. He shrugged, said he was more afraid of being forgotten than of dying. I did not answer, but I remembered what my mother had said, that no prayer is lost, even if it is not heard. That night, I prayed for him. As we crossed into the lands of Burgundy, the language changed slightly. The bread tasted different. The people stared longer, perhaps wary of the armed pilgrims passing through. Still, many gave what they could, a bowl of stew, a place in the barn. Once, an old woman pressed a small cross into my hand and told me to wear it always. I kept it in my satchel for many years. I still have it, though it is worn smooth by time and touch. The nights grew colder as we rose into the hill country. We walked with our cloaks pulled tight, breath fogging the air, hands stiff with cold. Fires were harder to build, and sleep came in short stretches. Yet no one turned back. Not yet. We were bound not just by oath or belief, but by the strange comfort of shared hardship. We were becoming something together. Not soldiers, not yet, but pilgrims of a different sort, walking toward a place none of us had seen, driven by a light only we could feel. I dreamed often during those nights, sometimes of home, sometimes of cities made of gold and light. Once I dreamed I stood before a great wall, with the sea crashing on one side and the desert on the other, and a voice called my name, though I could not tell if it was calling me forward or asking me to turn back. When I woke, the frost was thick on my blanket. Alon was already stirring the embers of our fire. He handed me a piece of bread and smiled without speaking. The road waited. Always it waited. Part 2. Through the forests of Christendom. There is a quiet that lives beneath the trees. Not the quiet of still air or empty rooms, but something older, deeper. As we passed into the great forests of Burgundy and beyond, I came to understand why the monks said trees remember. The trunks stood thick as towers, their roots pushed up from the soil like the bones of the earth. The path narrowed beneath the green canopy, and the light turned gold and green and brown, like candlelight through stained glass. We did not speak much in the woods. There were too many sounds already. The rustling of leaves above us, the drip of old rain falling from the canopy, the sharp cry of a bird startled from its perch. Our own footsteps became muffled, like the land itself had placed a soft hand over everything. Each morning we woke to the scent of damp earth. Our breath curled in the chill. The fires we lit at night became precious things, guarded carefully, coaxed to life with dry bark and patient breath. When they caught and danced, I would stare into the flames and see the faces of home. My mother kneeling in prayer. My father's hands tightening the yoke on the oxen. My sister's voice calling after me from the edge of the well. I held those memories close. In the deepest parts of the forest, the sun vanished by mid-afternoon. The days were short and the dark came fast. We walked by torchlight or not at all. We learned to judge time by the way the light filtered through the trees. A gray shimmer meant morning. A deep amber meant nightfall was close. There were roads carved through these woods long before we passed through them. Roman roads, some said. Old stone paths now overgrown with moss and roots. We followed them when we could, though often the forest had swallowed them whole. The men would joke about the ghosts of old legions marching alongside us, unseen but still proud. It was during one of those dusky evenings that we found the shrine. It stood alone in a clearing, no larger than a well house, its stones covered in lichen. A statue of the Virgin, worn by centuries, stood within. Someone had placed fresh herbs at her feet. Alon knelt first. Then the others followed. I stood a moment longer before joining them. There was a silence in that clearing that settled into my bones. I offered no grand prayer, only the same quiet words I had whispered since leaving home. Keep me upright. Keep me walking. We camped that night beside a slow stream that wound between ancient roots. The water was cold and clear. We drank from our palms and let it wash the dust from our faces. Someone produced a wheel of cheese from their pack, hard and dry but welcome. We shared what we had. No one took more than a share. In the firelight, I saw that one of the younger men had hung a carved cross from the branch above his bedroll. It swayed gently in the breeze. He watched it for a long time before closing his eyes. The next morning, we passed into flatter land. The forest thinned. Wide fields opened before us. Some had already been harvested, their stubble golden beneath the sky. Others were left fallow, ringed by stone fences and crooked hedges. In the distance, the smoke of farmsteads rose in lazy ribbons. We saw fewer pilgrims now, but still enough to remind us we were not alone. A group of women walked past us one afternoon, veils pulled close, carrying baskets of dried fish and barley bread. They did not speak, only nodded and kept walking. Another time, a man in a woolen cloak passed us on a mule, a long staff in hand and a rosary wound around his wrist. He sang as he rode, not loudly, but with a voice like water over stones. A soft song, a song of peace. Some nights we stayed in barns or under lean-tos offered by kind souls. Other times we slept in the open, our backs to tree trunks or stone walls. It mattered little. We had become used to the rhythm of the road, the aches in our legs. The way the cold pressed in at dawn had loosened its grip by midday. We no longer counted the miles, only the days since we had left Rouen. I had stopped trying to remember what day of the week it was. Time felt different now. Measured not in hours, but in how far we could walk before our legs gave out. It was in those quiet days that I began to notice the changes in myself, not in strength or skill, but in the way I listened, the way I watched the land unfold ahead of me. The road taught patience. It taught silence. I came to value the moments between words, a glance shared between companions, the sound of the wind lifting the grass, the smell of wood smoke that meant a village was near. One evening, as we approached the outskirts of a small town, a group of children came running toward us. They pointed and laughed, their hands tugging at our cloaks, their voices full of questions. One of them asked if I was a knight. I smiled and shook my head. I had no sword, no armor. only a walking stick and a cross sewn to my tunic. Still, they followed us a short way, throwing flowers and singing a song I did not know. I think they thought we were holy men. I did not correct them. At the edge of town, we were given warm bread and a place to sleep in the loft of a granary. The straw was soft and sweet-smelling. As I lay there, staring through the cracks in the beams at the stars above, I felt a stillness settle over me. For the first time since leaving home, I did not feel the need to pray for courage, only for gratitude. That night, I slept without dreams. In the weeks that followed, we passed through more towns. Some gave generously, others turned their eyes away. Not all believed in our cause. Not all saw the Crusaders as holy men. To some, we were just another burden to feed, another group of strangers trampling the fields. But even when words failed, there were gestures. A man placing a loaf on the edge of the road without a word. A girl slipping a ribbon into the hand of a passing marcher. An old woman waving from her doorway as if blessing us from afar. These moments mattered, more than the speeches, more than the sermons. And always the forest returned. Even after the wide fields and bustling markets, the trees would rise again, wrapping around the road like a great green memory. I came to welcome them. Their hush, their steadiness, their reminder that the world had endured longer than any war or crusade, and would go on long after we were gone. One morning, near the edge of a lake so still it mirrored the sky, I sat with Henri, the older man from our village. He was quiet most days, his limp slowing his pace, but never his spirit. That morning he told me about the war he had fought as a young man. He said he had seen cities burn and men beg for water in the dust, but the thing he remembered most was a woman who gave him an apple without asking his name. It was the only sweet thing he tasted for months. He said he thought of her still. We sat a long time by that lake, not speaking, only watching the water ripple where a bird landed and the mist curl at the edges of the trees. I think we both felt the road changing again. We were drawing closer to the mountains now. The land ahead would be harder, the air thinner, the path steeper, but we were not afraid. We had passed through the forests of Christendom. We had walked beneath trees older than kings. We had shared bread with strangers and slept beneath stars. Whatever waited ahead, we would meet it with steady hearts, and always the road would carry us forward. Part 3, The Weight of the Cross. Part 3, The Weight of the Cross. There comes a moment, though I do not know when exactly it began, when a burden becomes something more than what you carry. The wooden cross stitched into the front of my tunic had seemed a simple sign in the beginning, a mark of purpose, of belonging, a symbol to tell the world that I had chosen this road freely for the sake of something greater than myself. But as the days stretched longer and the path grew steeper, I began to feel its weight even when I lay in my bedroll at night. Not its shape or size, but the meaning it carried. It clung to me in silence, in the aches of my bones, in the spaces between each step. The others felt it too, though few spoke of it. We had marched through weeks of forest and valley. The weather had turned colder. The wind cut lower through the trees. Our rations grew thinner. Some nights we boiled roots we could not name. Others we fasted without complaint. There was a quiet resolve in our camp, not born of certainty, but of necessity. In the early days, the men had spoken often of Jerusalem. They had described it like a place from a holy book, wrapped in golden light, filled with singing. They had spoken of it as if it waited for us, just over the next ridge. But by now, we had learned how far the world could stretch. The Holy Land no longer felt like a place on a map. It felt like a horizon that moved with us, always ahead, never near. I began to pray less with words and more with silence. In the early hours when the camp stirred and the frost still clung to the grass, I would walk a short distance from the others and kneel beneath a tree or near a wall of stone. I would close my eyes and let the cold rest on my skin. I would think of my mother, her hands folded at the edge of her bed. I would think of the stories the priest used to tell, of saints who wandered the desert and drank only rain. And then I would rise again, the prayer still inside me, though no words had been spoken. One morning, we crossed paths with another group of pilgrims. Their leader was a monk in a dark robe, tall and thin, his eyes sunken but sharp. He spoke Latin to the priests among us and blessed each man in our company, pressing a thumb to their brows. When he reached me, he did the same, and I felt a sudden shiver down my spine. I asked him gently if he believed we were doing God's work. He looked at me for a long moment and said in a soft voice that only God knew the answer to such questions. That was the last thing he said before moving on with his group, their sandals silent on the frozen path. His words stayed with me. I carried them like a stone in my pocket. Only God knows. I did not know if that brought me comfort or fear. The days grew harder after that. We were nearing the foothills of the Alps. The air sharpened. The wind no longer hummed but howled, especially at night. Our cloaks no longer kept the cold out. We had to walk to stay warm. Rest became brief and restless. We wrapped ourselves in what we had and leaned against one another as we slept. Alon had developed a cough. At first it was light, the kind a man gets after a cold rain, but it lingered. Each day he walked slower, though he did not complain. One night I found him still awake after the others had gone quiet. He was staring at the stars with his hands clasped on his chest. He asked me if I ever thought we would reach the city. I said yes, because I believed he needed to hear it, but I did not know. I had begun to notice the silence between the men. It was not the silence of rest or peace. It was the silence of questions without answers, of thoughts that grew heavy but stayed unspoken. We still shared bread. We still helped each other lace our boots and adjust our packs. But the stories had faded. The songs were gone. Only the march remained. There was one morning, just before we began the climb into the mountains, when I looked at my reflection in a frozen stream. My face had changed. My beard had grown long. My eyes looked tired in a way I had never seen before. Not from sleep, but from seeing too much of the world too quickly. I no longer looked like the boy who had knelt in the dust at Rouen and sworn himself to the cross. I looked like a man who had forgotten what he hoped to find. And yet I did not turn back. There was something inside me that still held on. Not to glory or reward, but to the quiet promise I had made when I first placed one foot on the road. A promise to keep going, to finish what I had begun, even if I no longer knew what the end would look like. As we climbed into the colder air, each breath became harder. The paths turned to stone and ice. We saw the first of the snow, thin at first, like salt on the wind, then thicker, clinging to our cloaks and lashes. We pressed forward in narrow lines. Each man walked in the footprints of the one ahead. To step outside the path was to risk falling. The mountains offered no forgiveness. It was there, among the high ridges and wind-worn cliffs, that I felt the weight of the cross more than ever. Not on my tunic, but in my chest. In the way my thoughts circled without rest. In the way my heart pulled backward even as my legs pushed forward. I thought of the village again, of the smell of rye bread in the oven, of the soft sound of my sister's voice as she sang while fetching water. I thought of the priest's last blessing before we left, his fingers trembling as he made the sign of the cross. I thought of the silence after the last bell had rung, and we had stepped into the dawn. I carried all of this with me now. It was part of the burden. Not a punishment, but a memory that refused to fade. At one of the higher passes, we found shelter in a chapel carved into the rock. It was small, barely large enough for 10 men, but inside it was warm from the bodies and the oil lamps lit by monks who tended it. They gave us soup and quiet words. One of them handed me a small scrap of parchment with a verse written on it. It spoke of wandering in the wilderness, of being tested and shaped by the silence of the desert. I folded it and kept it in my satchel. That night, I dreamed again. I stood in a hall of stone with tall windows and no roof. The stars looked down through the open sky. I was alone, but I felt no fear. There was a voice, though I could not hear what it said, only that it was kind. When I woke, I felt rested for the first time in many days. We left the chapel before first light. The monks watched us go in silence. They did not wave. They only nodded, their faces unreadable in the dim light. The climb would continue. The path would grow harder, but the cross remained on my chest, and though I had grown weary of its weight, I still bore it. Because I had chosen to, and because I still believed, somewhere beneath the silence and snow, that the journey meant something, even if only to remind me of who I had been and who I was still becoming. Part 4. Across the Alps. The mountains rose before us like sleeping giants, their peaks lost in clouds, their sides carved by time into shapes of stone and snow. I had never seen land so vast and silent. The road narrowed as it climbed, winding through steep ravines and along cliffs where the earth dropped away without warning. One misstep could send a man tumbling into the endless white below. We walked slowly, our eyes downcast, our boots worn smooth by the stone. The wind grew sharper with each ascent. It tore through our cloaks and stung our skin until our cheeks burned and our lips cracked. Our voices were quieter now, even in camp. The cold seemed to take our breath before we could speak. There were no more songs, no stories shared beside the fire. Only the soft murmur of prayer and the rustle of cloth as men drew closer to the flames for warmth. We had entered the high places, a world where the trees no longer grew, where even the birds flew low and silent. The sky above was a pale, brittle blue by day, and by night it filled with stars so sharp and bright they seemed to press against the earth itself. I remember one evening when we paused on a wide plateau just before dusk. The sun slipped behind the distant peaks, painting the snow in shades of rose and gold. No one spoke. We simply stood and watched, our breath rising like smoke in the still air. For that moment, the cold was forgotten. Crossing the Alps took more than our strength. It took our will. Each day began with frozen fingers, stiff boots, and the slow tightening of belts around leaner waists. We walked in silence, each man lost in his own thoughts. We helped each other when we stumbled. We shared what little we had left. The bread had hardened into crusts, and the dried meat had grown tough and gray. But it was enough to keep us moving. One of the younger men in our company, named Etienne, began to fall behind. He was small and wiry and had never marched so far in his life. The cold had found its way into his chest. Each morning his cough grew louder. Each night he curled tighter beneath his cloak. Ellen and I took turns walking beside him, sharing our water and keeping his spirits from falling too low. I remember the way he tried to smile, even through the shivers. He said his mother had always told him that the mountains were the edge of the world, that beyond them lay lands only angels could walk. When Etienne's fever worsened, we carried him on a makeshift stretcher for a time. Others took turns as well, without complaint. But after 2 days, he could no longer eat. On the third night, he closed his eyes and did not wake. We buried him beneath a cairn of stones just off the trail. No priest was present, but we said what prayers we knew. I pressed one of his mother's ribbons into the rocks and placed my hand on the highest stone. The wind did not pause. The cold did not ease. But the silence around us deepened, as if the mountains had taken notice. That evening, I could not sleep. I sat apart from the others and looked out across the endless ridges where the moonlight touched the snow in long silver lines. I thought about the promise I had made when I first took the cross. I had not expected how hard it would become. I had not expected to lose so many. But I knew I would keep walking. Not because I believed I could change the world, but because I had chosen this path. And to turn back now would be to let go of something I still held dear, even if I could not name it. We continued the climb the next day, moving slower, speaking less. The passes narrowed. Sometimes we walked in single file, each man pressing his body close to the rock to avoid slipping. Snow fell more often now, covering the trail and hiding the dangers beneath. At times, we relied on the memory of those ahead. At others, we marked the path with branches or strips of cloth so others would not lose their way. One afternoon, as we neared the highest ridge, a storm moved in. The sky darkened without warning, and the wind rose like a great voice. Snow whipped against our faces, blinding us. We huddled close to the rock face and waited, the world around us reduced to white and gray. I remember the sound of the storm, not loud, but constant, like a whisper that would not stop. We spent that night beneath an overhang, barely enough room for the dozen of us still together. Our fire burned low, fed with scraps of dried wood we had carried for days. I watched the flames flicker against the stone and thought again of home. I imagined my mother stirring a pot over her hearth. I imagined my sister brushing her hair by candlelight. These memories became my warmth when the fire grew thin. By morning, the storm had passed. The sun rose bright and cold, revealing a world made new by snow. The mountains gleamed. The path ahead was still treacherous, but the wind had calmed. We walked carefully, helping each other down the icy slopes until we began to feel the air grow softer, the snow thinner, and the trees return, first as stunted shrubs, then as tall sentinels once more. The descent was not quick, but it brought with it a change. Our steps grew steadier. The aches in our bodies softened. We saw birds again, small and brown, darting through the trees. We heard the sound of streams running fast over rock. And then, one day, we smelled wood smoke not from our own fires, but from the hearths of a village. We had crossed the Alps. We had left behind a part of ourselves on those ridges. We had buried more than Etienne. We had buried the last of our illusions. What remained in us now was quieter, but stronger. Not hope exactly. Something deeper than that. A sense of being shaped, like stone underwater. The people of the village welcomed us with cautious hands. They had seen many pass before. They gave us bread, cheese, and a place to sleep. I remember sitting on a bench beside a barn and watching the clouds drift above the peaks. They no longer seemed so distant. They no longer frightened me. That night, I said my prayers as I always did. But this time, I gave thanks not only for safety or strength. I gave thanks for the silence of the high places, for the lessons they taught without words. The road ahead would carry us to lands unlike any I had known. War would wait for us, though we did not yet know how near it was. But in the quiet stillness of that mountain village, I felt something return to me. Not joy, not rest, but a calm resolve. I had crossed the mountains, and I would keep walking. Part 5, Among Foreign Tongues. Part 5, Among Foreign Tongues. The road beyond the mountains opened wide before us, but it no longer felt like the road we had known. The villages we passed through were different in ways we could not always name. The faces were the same as ours in shape, but their speech carried a rhythm I did not understand. Their prayers were spoken with different sounds. Even the way they broke bread or blessed their meals was unfamiliar. And so we began to understand what it meant to be strangers. In the beginning, we tried to speak with the people we met. Some welcomed us. Others kept their doors closed. A few watched from behind shutters or fence posts, their eyes cautious but not unkind. We learned quickly that kindness did not always require shared words. A woman handed us apples without speaking. A man pointed to a well when he saw our empty flasks. Another nodded toward a stable when the night came near and the wind began to rise. These small gestures carried more meaning than anything spoken aloud. The names of the towns meant nothing to me. They sounded like music from a land I had never seen. At times, a priest or merchant would speak enough of our tongue to guide us, but mostly we followed signs carved into stone or painted on wooden planks. We followed the sun by day and the stars by night. The land had grown flatter now, with low hills and wide meadows. Fields brushed by the wind and dotted with unfamiliar trees. The air was warmer. The smell of the earth had changed. I noticed it most when we passed olive groves for the first time. The scent was sharp and strange, both bitter and sweet. I had never tasted olives before that day. One of the locals offered a small bowl as we rested beneath the shade. They were darker than I expected, soft and strong on the tongue. I ate them slowly, unsure whether I liked them or not, but I did not forget the taste. We crossed paths with caravans now and then. Traders, pilgrims, and travelers who looked at us with curiosity. One group wore long robes of blue and gold and led camels burdened with spices and woven rugs. They did not speak our tongue, but one among them offered me a date from his satchel. I took it and thanked him with a nod. It was sweeter than anything I had ever eaten. At night, we heard new sounds in the distance, flutes and stringed instruments with voices like running water. Sometimes we saw firelight far off in the hills, flickering behind tents. The world was changing around us, and we moved through it like men caught between two dreams. One behind us, one still far ahead. Among us, the change was quiet but clear. We spoke less of home now, not because we had forgotten, but because it had become a place of memory, not destination. Our thoughts turned more often to what lay before us. We no longer asked when we might return, only how far remained, only how many more days our legs could carry us before the sea. Henri, the older man from our village, began walking slower. His limp worsened in the warmer air. I often walked beside him, helping him over the roughest ground. He rarely spoke, but once he told me that he dreamed often of his wife. She had passed many years ago, but in his dreams she always stood by the door with a loaf of bread in her hands. He said he never reached her. He always woke before he could take it from her. I did not know what to say, so I said nothing. But I remembered his dream for a long time. One afternoon we came upon a ruined monastery. The roof had collapsed, and the stone walls were worn by time and wind. Vines grew through the cracks, and birds nested where the altar had once stood. Still, we entered quietly and sat among the broken pews. There was no priest, no hymn, but we felt something holy in that place, a silence that was not empty, but full. I closed my eyes and listened to the wind moving through the high, open arches. I imagined the monks who had once walked those halls. I imagined them lighting candles in the morning, grinding herbs in the courtyard, singing in the cold dawn before the world awoke. I wondered if they too had known the feeling of being far from all they understood. That night, we camped beside a slow river. The reeds rustled in the breeze, and frogs sang quietly as the moon rose. I lay awake for a long time, staring at the stars, thinking of the words I could no longer remember in my own tongue. Prayers that had once come easily now felt distant, as if they had drifted away on the road and been replaced with silence. But the silence did not frighten me. It had become my companion. In the days that followed, we moved through fields of golden wheat and low stone villages with whitewashed walls. The churches here were built differently, shorter towers, broader doors. The bells rang in unfamiliar tones, and yet they called us still. We answered with bowed heads and weary steps. Alain had begun to collect small stones from each village we passed. He said they helped him remember the places we had seen. He kept them wrapped in a cloth tied to his belt. Sometimes he would show them to me by firelight. A smooth red stone from a riverbank, a pale piece of marble from a crumbling fountain, a shard of blue tile he found outside an inn. He said he would bring them home one day. He said they would remind him that he had walked farther than any man in our village ever had. I did not collect stones, but I carried a small bundle of herbs from the olive grove. I did not know their names, only that they reminded me of a moment when the air had been warm and still, and a stranger had offered me food with open hands. We came to a city near the coast one evening, just as the sun was setting. Its walls were high and its gates heavy with iron. The guards at the entrance wore tunics of a style we had not seen before. Their voices were sharp, but not cruel. We showed our papers and crosses. After some hesitation, they allowed us through. Inside, the streets were alive with color and sound. Markets filled the squares. Men shouted in tongues I did not understand. Spices hung in the air. Fabrics swayed from stalls like sails on a ship. It was the first true city we had seen since Rouen, but it did not feel like Rouen. It felt like a different world. We stayed in a small church on the eastern side of the city. The priest spoke only a few words of our tongue, but he offered us bread and a place to sleep. That night, as I lay beneath the wooden beams of the chapel roof, I felt the weight of the journey behind me and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. I felt the road still pulling at me, like a thread I could not see but could not stop following. I did not know what the next days would bring, only that we would soon reach the sea, and beyond it, the land of which we had heard so many stories, the land where holy footsteps had once fallen, the land we were sworn to see. But for now, I closed my eyes to the sound of bells echoing through foreign streets, and I slept as a pilgrim sleeps, far from home, but still moving forward. Part 6. To the shores of the Great Sea. We reached the sea just after midday. The air had grown heavy with salt, and the wind carried a sound I had never heard before, a sound like breath, slow and endless. When we crested the hill and looked down from the edge of the bluffs, it stretched before us, a vast, moving sheet of light and motion. The Mediterranean, the great sea the priests spoke of in their sermons. I had imagined it so many times, but nothing had prepared me for the way it breathed, how it seemed to move with a purpose of its own. We stood there in silence. No one spoke. No one needed to. We had walked across mountains and plains and through towns where we could not speak the language, and now we stood at the edge of the known world. The water shimmered beneath the sun, broken only by the slow tilt of distant sails. They moved like birds, slow and steady, their white wings stretched taut against the sky. That evening we made our way down toward the port. It was a city of stone and sun, with buildings rising from the hillside like worn teeth. The streets were narrow and loud. Merchants called from shaded stalls. Children ran barefoot through the alleys. The smell of fish hung in the air, mingling with the sharper scent of olives and smoke from the clay ovens that lined the market square. The port itself was alive with movement. Ships groaned as they rocked against the docks. Ropes were coiled and thrown. Barrels rolled. Men shouted orders in tongues none of us knew. The rhythm of the sea touched everything here. Even the footsteps on the boards echoed like waves striking rock. We were to wait for a vessel bound for the Levant, arranged by a wealthy noble who had pledged his fortune to the cause. His name was spoken with reverence, though I never saw him with my own eyes. His agents met us and directed us to a corner of the city where other pilgrims were gathering. There, we were given a space in the courtyard of an old monastery that overlooked the harbor. Each morning, we rose to the sound of gulls and the tolling of the chapel bell. We ate what we were given, hard bread, lentils, and dates, and we waited. Some days passed slowly. Others vanished before we knew they had begun. The sunlight struck the white walls in strange patterns, and the sea seemed to change color with every hour. At dawn, it was gray-blue, quiet and gentle. By midday, it turned bright and sharp, full of noise. At dusk, it became gold, then dark as iron. I spent many hours sitting on the edge of the harbor, watching the water move. I tried to imagine the land on the other side, the Holy Land, Jerusalem. The names came easily, but their shapes remained distant. I did not know what they looked like. I only knew what I had been told. Stories passed from mouth to mouth, shaped by faith and distance. One afternoon, as I sat beside the water, I was joined by a man from another company. He was older than me, with a thick beard and a voice low from use. He told me he had seen the sea before, many years ago, when he was young and foolish. He had sailed with merchants across these waters and learned the currents and winds. Now he returned for something greater. He spoke of the cross not as a mark of power, but as a reminder of service. He said the sea would test us more than the mountains ever could. That night, I dreamed I was on a ship made of glass. Beneath me, the sea stretched forever, and I could see everything below. Cities drowned in silence, fields of coral, creatures I could not name. The ship did not move by sail or oar, but by prayer. I woke just before dawn, my mouth dry, my heart quiet. The morning our ship arrived, the harbor buzzed with noise. It was larger than I expected, with 3 high masts and a curved hull that had weathered many voyages. The sailors moved quickly, their voices rough with salt and wind. We gathered our things and stood in line beneath the rising sun. Some prayed, others wept softly. I felt something in my chest that I could not name. Not fear, exactly, but something close to it. The sense that the world behind us was truly gone now, and that ahead lay something vast and unknowable. We boarded in silence. The decks creaked beneath our boots. The ropes groaned under strain. I found a place near the rail and looked out over the water. The sky was clear. The wind was steady. The sails rose like wings. As we pulled away from the harbor, the city grew smaller behind us. The white walls faded into the hills. The voices of the port became whispers. Then only the sound of waves remained. I did not look back. Instead, I turned my face toward the rising sun and listened to the wind. That night, as we drifted farther into the open sea, I lay on the deck and looked up at the stars. They felt closer now, as if the sea had lifted us toward them. I thought of the long road we had walked to reach this place, of the forests and fields, of the high passes and cold nights, of Etienne and his quiet smile, of my mother's hands, folded in prayer. I did not know what awaited us across the water, but I knew I would face it with the same steps that had carried me this far, one foot after the other, one breath at a time, with the sea beneath me and the silence of the road still in my heart. Part 7. The Crossing. The sea does not speak in the way the land does. It has no paths to follow, no markers to measure time. There are no trees to judge distance, no stones to rest upon, no walls to lean against. Only the water, moving always, never still. The wind carried us forward, but where it came from and where it would go next, we could not say. At first, the ship felt alive beneath our feet. It creaked and shifted with the tide, answering to forces we could not see. Each step required balance, each movement care. I had never been on a vessel before. I did not know how the floor could rise and fall with such slow certainty, as though it breathed along with the waves. We slept below deck when the weather allowed. The space was tight and dark, filled with the scent of salt and pitch. We lay close to one another, wrapped in cloaks damp from spray, listening to the groan of wood and the slap of waves against the hull. Some slept easily, lulled by the motion. Others stayed awake through the night, their minds pacing in circles. The days were measured by the sun. We rose with its light and watched it climb high above us, only to fall again into the western sky. The sailors knew their work well. They spoke little to us, but their hands moved with purpose, tightening ropes, trimming sail, checking the direction of the wind. Their eyes always watched the horizon. There were moments when the sea was kind. The sky would clear and the water would smooth to a gentle roll. We would sit near the rail, eating what we were given, hard bread, dried figs, and sometimes a bit of fish from the morning catch. In those hours, I would listen to the wind moving through the rigging, a sound like a distant hymn. I would watch the sunlight dance on the waves and feel the cool spray on my face. But the sea does not stay kind for long. One night, the sky turned gray and heavy. The wind shifted. The crew moved quickly, shouting to one another in tones I did not understand. The sails were drawn in. The ropes tightened. The ship groaned and swayed with greater force. Soon, the rain began. Not a soft rain, but a driving curtain that turned the deck slick and black. The waves rose higher. The wind howled against the mast. We were told to stay below. The space filled with the sound of the storm above and the fear that clung to every man inside. Some whispered prayers. Others gripped whatever they could hold. I sat with my back to the wall and tried to steady my breath. The ship rose and fell like a living thing. Each lurch pulled at my stomach. Each groan of the hull sounded like a warning. I thought of the chapel where we had rested before setting sail. The bells in the harbor, the quiet voice of the priest who blessed us without knowing our names. I thought of the high mountains and the frozen stream where I had seen my reflection. I wondered if the sea would take us before we could see the land again. The storm passed before dawn. We emerged into a world washed clean, the sky pale and wide, the sea still restless but no longer angry. The crew moved like ghosts, silent and soaked, tending to the lines and checking the rigging. Some of our supplies had been lost. A barrel had broken free and rolled into the water. A torn sail hung limp from the mast, but the ship had held. We gave thanks with bowed heads and trembling hands. In the days that followed, we saw no other ships, only birds that flew low and then vanished. The sky stretched endlessly above us, and the water reflected its shape. It was easy to forget the world behind us, easier still to forget that another world waited ahead. One evening, I stood at the stern as the sun began to fall. The light turned the waves gold and silver, and I saw something that caught my breath. A small pod of dolphins followed beside us, their bodies rising and falling in smooth arcs. They moved without fear, their path steady and sure. For a moment, they seemed like spirits, sent to remind us that the world still held joy. I watched them until they disappeared into the blue. Each night, I dreamed of land, of hills and stones and trees that did not move, of footsteps on solid earth. But when I woke, there was only the sea, endless and quiet, rising and falling beneath us. Alan had grown quiet. He no longer joked as he once did. He spent long hours watching the horizon, his hands clasped together, his lips moving in silent prayer. He told me once, as we shared a piece of dried fruit, that he had begun to see faces in the clouds. I did not laugh. I had seen them too. The sea, for all its distance and danger, had a strange power to reflect what we carried inside. It offered no answers, only space, only time. One afternoon, we spotted a shape in the distance. At first, we thought it a trick of the light. But slowly, the outline grew clearer, a strip of land rising from the water, a promise still far away. The crew changed course. The sails caught the wind. We stood along the rail and watched the land grow closer. By dusk, we saw the shape of trees, white buildings on the hills, a small harbor tucked into the curve of the shore. Voices drifted across the water. Lamps flickered along the docks. The sails were lowered. The ropes were cast. The ship slowed, and we felt it settle beneath us like a beast finally at rest. We had crossed the sea. We stepped onto the dock with unsteady legs. The land did not move, but we still felt the rocking beneath our feet. It would take time to find our balance again. The air was different here. Drier. Heavier with dust and sun. The sky held a different kind of light. The stars above were the same, but they felt sharper, closer. We had come far, farther than I had ever dreamed. And though the hardest road still waited ahead, I stood that night beneath the foreign sky and gave thanks. Not because I was ready, but because I was still walking. Because the sea had not taken me. Because the wind had carried me to the shore. And because my feet, though sore and tired, still wished to follow the path before me. Part 8. Arrival in the Holy Land. The first thing I noticed was the dust. It clung to everything. To our boots, to our sleeves, to the folds of our cloaks and the creases of our skin. The earth here was light and dry, the color of ash warmed by the sun. Even the wind carried dust. It rose with every footfall, dancing in the air before settling again like a breath held too long. We had landed at a port town smaller than we expected. It sat low against the coast, built from pale stone that seemed to shimmer in the heat. The harbor was lined with boats whose shape was unfamiliar, longer, flatter, sails cut differently than those we had seen in Europe. The people moved with a rhythm I did not understand. They walked slowly, their heads wrapped in cloth, their eyes narrow beneath the bright sky. The language that filled the air was unlike anything I had heard before. Soft, flowing, full of sounds that slipped past the tongue like water through fingers. We understood nothing of it, and yet we knew we were being watched. Not with open hostility, but with quiet caution, as if the land itself had grown used to the arrival of strangers and no longer rushed to greet them. We were led to a church on the edge of town. It was small, but well kept. The priest who welcomed us was a tall man with skin like bronze and robes stained by sand. He spoke Latin with difficulty, but we understood enough. He offered us water, dates, and a place to rest. His voice was calm. He said little of the world beyond the town walls, only that we should be careful where we stepped. That night, we slept in the church courtyard. The stars above seemed closer here. They filled the sky in quiet clusters, sharper than before. The air was still, the heat of the day lingering in the stones. I lay with my hands behind my head, staring up, thinking of how far we had come. I remembered the first frost on the fields behind my father's house. I remembered the smell of pine in the forests of Burgundy. I remembered the breath of snow in the Alps, the salt spray on the ship's rail, and the sound of dolphins beside the hull. And now I lay beneath a foreign sky, the dust of a holy land beneath my back. In the morning, we began our journey inland. We were no longer alone. Other groups had arrived by sea, and soon we marched together in loose formation. There were knights among us now, men on horseback clad in mail and marked with bright crosses. Their armor shone in the sun, but the heat pressed down on us all. Even the horses moved slowly, their breaths heavy, their flanks dark with sweat. The landscape unfolded in shades of gold and ochre. Hills rose and fell like waves of stone. The trees were sparse, gnarled things that twisted toward the sky. The grass was dry and brittle. Small villages dotted the horizon, low and square, walls the same color as the ground. People watched from rooftops as we passed. Some turned away. Others held still, their faces unreadable. We marched without speaking. The heat stole our breath. The dust filled our throats. Water became precious, each drop measured and shared. The sun stood high above, offering no relief. I wrapped cloth around my neck and shaded my face as best I could, but still my skin burned. The world here did not yield. It did not bend. It stood still and waited, as if to see who among us would remain upright. On the third day inland, we passed a ruined tower. It stood alone on a hill, its top broken, its stones scattered. We paused beneath it for shade. No one spoke of what battle had broken it or what hands had once built it. It had no flag, no cross, only the marks of time and war. I stood within its shadow and felt something settle inside me, a silence that was not peace but understanding. That this land held stories far older than ours. That it had seen more than we could ever know. At night, the wind turned cold. It moved across the plains like a whisper. I would lie beneath the stars, listening, wondering what the wind carried with it. Perhaps the voices of those who had marched before us. Perhaps only sand. Alon walked beside me most days. He had grown quieter since the sea. His steps were slower. He spoke only when asked. Once, as we watched the sun set over a dry ridge, he said the light here reminded him of firelight through stained glass. I nodded. I had noticed it too. The colors were deeper, the shadows longer. The dusk did not fall gently. It arrived like a curtain being drawn. One afternoon, we reached a ridge that looked out over a valley. In the distance, we saw the spires of a city, low and wide, ringed by stone walls. The men around me fell to their knees. Some wept. Others raised their hands to the sky. I stood in silence, watching. Jerusalem. It did not look like I'd imagined. There were no golden streets, no choir of angels, only the outline of towers and roofs, dust rising in the distance. Yet there was something in the shape of it, in the way it sat beneath the sky, that held me still. The city felt quiet, even from afar, and heavy, as if it bore the weight of every step we had taken to reach it. We would not enter that day. The valley ahead still held danger. The city did not welcome us with open gates. We would wait. And in the waiting, we would pray. Not for victory, not for glory, but for guidance. That night, we camped near a grove of fig trees. The fruit hung low and ripe. I ate one slowly, savoring its sweetness. It was the first sweetness I had tasted in many days. I sat beneath the branches and watched the sky grow dark, the stars blink into view one by one. I thought of the journey behind me. I thought of the city ahead. I thought of my mother's voice when she sang. And for a moment, I did not feel far from home, only far from the man I had been when I left it. Part 9, The Siege. The waiting was the hardest part. We came to the city as the sun was rising. The air was still and pale. Jerusalem stood before us, quiet and wide, its walls stretched like an old scar across the land. From a distance, it did not shout. It did not gleam. It simply existed, heavy with time, holding its breath. There was no welcome, no trumpet, no gates swinging open, just the distant hum of life behind the stone, and the knowledge that we were not expected in peace. We camped on the hills to the west, near the olive trees. Their trunks were twisted and gray, their roots pushed up through the dry earth like hands reaching for something lost. Some men knelt as soon as they saw the towers rise behind the trees. Others stood in silence. No one laughed. The siege did not begin with fire or fury. It began with watching. We studied the walls, counted the guards, traced the movement of smoke above the rooftops. The city watched us, too. We could feel its eyes behind the arrow slits, behind the silence. Sometimes we thought we saw faces, then nothing. A curtain drawn, a figure gone. Our leaders met beneath the shade of a low tent. Maps were spread, plans were whispered. But for most of us, there was little to do but wait. Each morning we woke with the sun already warm on our backs. Each evening we lay down with our bellies half full and our thoughts heavy. I spent long hours walking the line of our camp. I counted the steps from the fig grove to the outer trench. I watched the sky change above the city. I listened for sounds that never came. No bell, no song, no voice calling out from the walls. Just the breath of wind across stone. Alon grew restless. He sharpened his knife with more care than needed. He prayed aloud now, his words fast and urgent. I sat beside him in the evenings, though we rarely spoke. Sometimes he would speak of his home, the color of the river near his mill, the way his father's dog barked at geese. He talked as if afraid he might forget. I understood. Each day we built. We gathered wood from the hills and shaped it into frames and beams. We dragged it downhill and set it into place. Ladders, carts, siege towers that rose slowly, nailed together by hands that once sewed grain and spun rope. We were not soldiers, but we had become something close, not by training, but by time, and dust, and need. There were few battles in those early days. Only glances, only the sound of tools, only the thud of stones falling into place. But the city never slept. We heard it. We felt it in the way the earth hummed beneath our boots, the way the air grew tighter when we stepped too close to the walls, the way the silence around us never lasted long. One morning, a man in another company climbed a ridge near the southern gate and stood too long in view. A bolt struck him from the wall. He fell without sound. By the time we reached him, his eyes were open, but he was already gone. I remember the look on his face. Not pain, not fear, only surprise. We buried him near the edge of the camp. A small cross was made from olive branches. His name was Itard. I had never spoken to him, but that night I spoke his name aloud before sleep. Our rations began to thin. The water we drew from nearby wells tasted of metal and dust. The bread was hard, the meat sparse, yet we endured, because we had come too far to do anything else. Each evening I walked to the edge of camp and looked at the city. The towers stood still against the sky. The stones turned amber in the setting sun, and I would ask myself what waited behind them. Was the Holy Sepulchre as grand as we had been told? Did the air smell of frankincense? Were the streets narrow or wide? Were the people afraid of us? Were we afraid of ourselves? One night, a storm passed near. Lightning danced on the horizon, but no rain came. The air was thick, the sky full of dust. In our tent, the men lay still, listening to the distant thunder. Someone whispered a psalm. Another began to cry, quietly, trying not to wake the others. I stayed awake until the light returned. There was a boy in the village near mine who used to say that the heart of a man is like a candle. The wind can make it flicker, but the wick must choose whether to burn. I think of him now, though I cannot remember his name. Only the way he laughed when he dropped his pail in the stream and chased it barefoot through the reeds. Perhaps he is still there. Perhaps his candle still burns. Mine had begun to burn slower, but it had not gone out. As the days dragged on, the machines grew taller. The towers now stood like wooden giants, staring at the walls from a distance. They would move soon. The priests had begun to fast. The knights sharpened their swords. The whispers grew louder. They said it would begin before the next moon. But nothing had changed in me. I still woke before the sun, still watched the sky, still felt the dust on my tongue, still whispered the same prayer. A prayer not for victory, not even for peace, just a prayer to keep walking, to keep the wick lit, even in silence, even in siege, even in the shadow of the city that still would not speak. Part 10. What we leave behind. When the assault began, it did not feel like the start of something. It felt like the end of many small silences. The quiet that had hung between us, day after day, had stretched too far. The waiting had frayed our nerves. And when the horns blew and the men rose to their feet, there was no cheer, no shout, only motion. Steady, heavy, a kind of surrender, not to defeat, but to the next step we had known would come. The siege towers were rolled forward. The wheels groaned under their weight. The ladders followed. Arrows flew. Stones fell. The air filled with dust and cries and the dry taste of fear. But the fighting for most of us remained distant, a narrow band of fire at the edge of our world, a place just beyond where we stood. Alain was among those called to push the southern tower. I helped him tighten the cords on his mail. He smiled, but his hands shook. I wanted to tell him something that might steady him, but all I could say was, "Walk carefully." He nodded and turned to go. I never saw him again. Later, someone said he made it to the wall, that he climbed halfway before the stones came down. Others said he was struck by an arrow. I searched the faces that returned that evening. He was not among them. I went to the edge of the ridge where we had often sat in the evenings, watching the sun set on the city walls. His footprints were still faintly visible in the dust. I stood there a long time, waiting for the light to shift, waiting for something that would not come. There was no time for mourning. More towers moved forward. More men climbed. The air was thick with smoke and ash. The groans of the wounded echoed in the spaces between our tents. At night, we lay on the ground, too tired to speak, too tired to cry. Henri fell 2 days later. He had volunteered to bring water to the men near the eastern trench. A stone from the wall struck him across the back. They carried him back at dusk. He did not wake. I sat beside him for a time, watching the last light fall across his face. He looked peaceful, as if dreaming. I hoped he had seen her, his wife, waiting with that loaf of bread. I hoped, this time, he had reached her. Each loss made the world feel smaller. The fire burned closer to the bone. There were names I could no longer remember, but faces I would never forget. A man who sang quietly while mending torn cloaks. Another who shared a piece of sugar on the long walk through the hills. A boy who had drawn pictures in the dirt with a stick when we waited in the port. Gone now, though their laughter still echoed behind my eyes. The city still loomed, still silent, still unchanged. But we had changed. Not as conquerors. Not yet. Only as men who had been asked to carry more than they could name. One morning, I rose before dawn and walked alone. I passed the fig grove, past the broken trench where the water had gone still, past the ridge where Alain's voice had once carried in the wind. I stopped at the edge of the field where the first tower had burned. Its frame lay blackened and hollow. The ground around it was scorched, and nothing grew. I knelt there, not to pray, only to sit, only to feel the earth beneath my hands. There was no grand vision, no sudden peace, only the breath of wind across my skin and the quiet weight of the sun beginning to rise. I did not know what remained in me, only that I had not yet fallen, only that my feet still carried me forward. Even now, we buried our dead where we could. Shallow graves behind the tents. Small stones placed to mark them. No one spoke as we dug. No one asked questions. We worked in silence, our hands blistered and our eyes turned down. One man began carving names into a plank of wood near the chapel tent. Each night, he added more. The list grew long. I read them once, then no more. I could not bear to see the names become numbers. What we left behind was not just the men, it was the moments. A shared cup of water, a fire lit with trembling fingers, a psalm whispered when the sky was still. These were the things that stayed with me, not the clash of iron, Not the shouts, not the battle itself, but the pauses, the spaces in between, the sighs, the hush, the final glance. We carried on. Because we had to. Because the city still stood. Because the sun still rose. But something inside us had changed. We had become quieter. Not defeated, just emptied. And in that emptiness, something soft began to take root. Not hope, not yet, but a kind of endurance. A silence that knew it would be heard one day. Even if only by the wind. Even if only by the stones. Even if only by the God who had watched us all along. Part 11, Jerusalem. We entered the city at dawn. The gates had opened in the night. Some said the defenders had fled. Others said they had fallen. I do not know which is true, only that when the first light touched the stones, the walls stood silent, and the path ahead was clear. We walked slowly, not as victors, not as pilgrims, but as men too tired to feel anything all at once. Our boots moved through the dust and ash. Our hands gripped weapons out of habit, not need. The streets were empty. The windows shuttered. The silence deeper than any church I had ever known. Jerusalem. The name had echoed through our prayers, our songs, our dreams. Now it echoed through the alleyways, caught between the stones and the wind. I had thought the city would shine, but it was old, tired, worn smooth by time and blood and the weight of too many footsteps. The buildings were pale, made of soft stone, crumbling in places, patched in others. Arches framed narrow lanes. Wooden beams stretched from wall to wall. Clay pots rested on steps. The scent of smoke hung in the air. It did not feel like a place from the stories. It felt like a place where people lived, and where many had died. We moved in small groups, careful and slow. No one spoke above a whisper. No one sang. A few fell to their knees, overcome by something wordless. Others stared ahead, as if looking for a vision that would not come. I walked beside two men I barely knew. One carried a flag torn at the edge. The other had blood dried along his sleeve. We passed a courtyard where vines crept up a stone wall, and I saw a small orange tree, its fruit bright against the dust. I stopped for a moment just to look at it, just to breathe. This was the city we had crossed the sea to find. This was the prize of our long and bitter road. But it did not feel like victory. It felt like something else, something softer, something sad. We were told to gather at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. I did not know where it was. Few of us did. The narrow streets turned often. The signs were written in letters I could not read. We followed the bells. They rang slowly, one after the other, deep and hollow. We walked toward the sound. The church rose behind a gate of iron and stone, larger than I expected, but not grand. Its walls bore the marks of time, blackened in places, cracked in others. The door was open. A priest stood at the threshold, his eyes wide and tired. We entered. The air was cool, heavy with incense. The light filtered through narrow windows high above, catching the smoke in shafts of gold and gray. The floor beneath our feet was worn smooth. The stones shone faintly, as if from years of touch. I saw men fall to their knees. Others bowed their heads. I stood still. I had imagined this moment so many times. What it would feel like, what I might say. But there were no words in me, only breath, only the sound of footsteps. Only the soft echo of prayers whispered by men who no longer remembered their own voices. I made my way toward the tomb. It was small, lower than I expected, carved from the earth itself. I knelt beside it and placed my hand on the edge of the stone. It was warm, not from the sun, but from the breath of the place, as if the stone itself remembered. I did not cry. I did not smile. I only closed my eyes and let the silence fill me. I thought of my mother's hymn, sung low as she ground flour. I thought of Etienne coughing beside the fire. I thought of Henry's dream of bread and home. I thought of Alain's voice as he laughed beneath the olive trees. All of them with me now, in the stillness of this holy place. Not gone, not lost, only changed. After a time, I rose. Outside the church, the sun had climbed higher. The city had begun to stir. A child ran across a distant rooftop. A dove cooed from beneath a cracked archway. The world did not pause for us. It kept moving, as it always had. We were told we could stay for a time. Rest, heal, pray. But none of us knew what to do with stillness. We had lived for so long in movement, in hunger, in fear, in longing. To be still was its own kind of trial. That night, I slept beneath the stars, on the rooftop of a stone house near the edge of the city. The sky above Jerusalem was wide and full of light. I watched it as I drifted toward sleep. I did not dream. Not that night. I had reached the end of the road, but I did not yet know what it meant. Part 12. The March Back. We left the city quietly. There were no banners raised, no fanfare, only the sound of footsteps on stone and the slow creak of leather packs. Some of us had stayed in Jerusalem longer than others. Some had left earlier, unable to rest in a place so full of memory. For me, it had been 3 weeks, long enough for the blisters on my hands to heal, long enough for the silence inside me to settle. The road leading out of the city wound downward through dry gullies and narrow passes. The light was different here, brighter, but not softer. It pressed down rather than warm. The air carried dust and little else. We kept to the shade when we could. We drank sparingly. The taste of metal never left our mouths. I did not know who had ordered the march. Perhaps there was no order at all, only the slow gathering of men who had nothing left to wait for. The city had not changed us as we had hoped. It had received our prayers, our sweat, our blood, but it had given no answers. We were not leaving with treasures, only with stories, and not all of them could be spoken aloud. Some men walked in silence. Others filled the air with hollow words as if speaking could hold the past in place. There were few smiles, fewer songs. The road had grown longer somehow, now that we walked away from the place we had carried in our hearts for so long. One evening, as we made camp near a dry stream bed, I found myself beside a man I had seen often during the siege but never spoken to. He was sharpening the edge of a rusted knife. He looked at me and said, quietly, that he had dreamed of his brother last night. The brother had died 2 winters before, lost to illness before the call to the cross had ever reached their village. In the dream, they were children again, throwing stones into the river and laughing. I listened, said nothing. The stars came out above us, the sky wide and unblinking. We did not speak again, but when we lay down, I saw him still smiling faintly, his hands folded beneath his head. In the days that followed, the group thinned. Some fell behind. Others broke off toward coastal towns, hoping for ships bound for home. A few chose to stay in the land they had fought for, claiming patches of earth or joining the orders that remained behind. I understood their choice. Some roads feel too long to walk a second time. For those of us who continued on foot, the days passed like stones dropped in a well. One by one, each the same, each vanishing into silence. I carried little now. My satchel was worn thin. My boots cracked. The cross on my tunic had faded nearly to thread. I no longer felt it pulling on my chest. Only a quiet space where its weight used to live. There were moments of peace. One morning, we passed through a valley where the wind stirred wildflowers along the ridge. Their colors surprised me. Yellow, red, deep blue. I paused to look at them and felt something inside me loosen. It did not last long, but it stayed with me. Another evening, we came upon a spring hidden beneath the roots of a fig tree. The water was cold, sweet, and clear. We drank in silence, washing our faces, cupping the liquid in our hands like treasure. A man beside me wept softly as he drank. I did not ask why. We slept when we could, under trees, in caves, beneath the stars. The ground was our blanket, the sky our roof, and the road our only companion. We passed through villages both empty and full. Some welcomed us with suspicion, others with food. A few had nothing to give, and so we moved on. There was little to offer in return, only stories, and not all stories are meant to be shared. One night, I found myself alone. The others had chosen a camp further behind, but I had kept walking. I made a fire from dry branches and sat with my back against a boulder, listening to the night. Far off, I heard the sound of an owl. The wind whispered through the stones, and I realized I no longer knew what I was returning to. My village might still stand. My mother might still wait beside the hearth, humming her soft hymn, or they might be gone. The world I had left behind felt like a dream I had once held in both hands. Now it was a blur, but the journey had given me something else. Not answers, not certainty, but quiet, a kind of stillness beneath the noise of memory. A space to breathe, even when the breath was heavy. A space to listen, even when nothing spoke. We continued west, toward the sea, toward ships that might carry us back across the same waters that once opened before us like a promise. But the man who had stood at the rail watching dolphins rise from the waves no longer stood beside me. He lived only in memory, like Alain, like Henri, like the man I used to be. The march back was not a return. It was a passing through, from one life into another, and I walked it not to find what I had lost, but simply to keep walking, to let the silence grow, to let it become enough. Part 13, Years in Silence. I came home in spring. The snow had melted in the high country, and the rivers had begun to swell with new water. The trees were just starting to open their leaves again, soft green against the pale sky. Birds had returned to the fields. The air carried the scent of earth waking after sleep. I walked into the village near dusk, with the sun falling behind the chapel roof. The bell rang just once, its sound low and distant. A few children watched me from the road. They said nothing. I must have looked like a stranger. I felt like one. My mother was still alive. Her hair had gone white, and her back was bent, but when she opened the door and saw me, she did not speak. She only reached for my hands, held them in hers, and closed her eyes. We stood like that for a long time, the quiet between us deeper than words. She had thought me lost. There had been no letters, no news, only prayers. She had lit a candle for me every week. Some had melted away without an answer. Others, she said, burned longer than expected. My father had passed the year before. He had gone to sleep one night and simply not woken. There had been no pain, only stillness. The way an old oak falls in the forest, not with a crash, but as a whisper. The house was smaller than I remembered. The roof lower, the walls thinner, but it was clean, warm. The same chair still stood by the hearth. The same clay jar held dried herbs on the shelf. Time had not stopped in my absence. It had moved forward without me. I slept in my old bed that night, the straw rustling beneath me, the blanket pulled up to my chin. I listened to the wind outside, soft against the shutters, and thought of all the places I had slept since I last lay there. Under stars, under sail, beneath the ruined walls of a city I had once feared to name. I did not dream. In the weeks that followed, I worked with my hands. The fields needed mending. Fences had broken. Stones had shifted in the frost. I rose early, as I had on the march, and let my body remember the rhythm of labor. The world here did not move quickly. It breathed in seasons. It taught patience. Some asked where I had been. Others already knew. The story had reached them in pieces, heard in the market, or passed from traveler to traveler. I did not offer more. When they asked if I had truly seen the holy city, I nodded. When they asked what it was like, I said only, quiet. They did not ask again. The years passed gently. I did not marry. I had no wish to begin a new story while the old one still echoed in my bones. I lived beside my mother, cared for her as she grew older, and buried her beneath the yew tree when her time came. I dug the grave myself, carved her name into the stone, and afterward I sat beneath that tree and sang the hymn she used to hum in the kitchen, slow and low, until the wind carried it away. I took on small tasks in the village, helping mend roofs, tending the sick, reading letters for those who could not. I became the man people turned to in quiet moments, not because I was wise, but because I listened. I had learned how to listen on the road, how to hold silence without filling it, how to let it speak on its own. The cross on my tunic had faded long ago. I kept it folded in a drawer beside my bed. Sometimes I would take it out and run my fingers along the thread, remembering the day it was stitched to my chest. The day I thought I knew what it meant. Now, I was not so certain, but it still felt like mine. In the winters, when the nights grew long and the fields lay under snow, I would sit beside the fire and warm my hands. The wood would crackle, the light would flicker across the walls, and in those moments, I would feel the road again, not as something behind me, but as something still within me. The sound of boots in dust, the creak of leather straps, the wind across the stone, the breath before a prayer. I did not speak of the battles, only of the figs, of the spring in the hills, of the boy who sang as he carried water, of the way the stars looked above Jerusalem when no one else was awake. These were the things I kept, not the violence, not the fire, but the quiet, the spaces in between, where something like truth lives, not in shouts, but in whispers, not in answers, but in walking. And so I lived, one day at a time, listening for the road in the sound of the wind. Part 14, A Prayer for the Lost. There are days when I remember their faces more clearly than my own. They come to me in the early morning, just before the sun rises, when the light is soft and the air is still. I sit on the bench beneath the yew tree where my mother now rests, and I watch the mist gather over the fields. In that quiet hour, the years fall away and I see them again. Etienne, with his thin frame and stubborn cough, always smiling through the ache. Henri, walking slow but steady, humming the psalms under his breath. Alain, with eyes full of fire, always the first to laugh, always the last to sleep. And the others whose names I did not know, but whose hands helped pull carts through the mud, who shared their last crust of bread without hesitation, who whispered prayers over their wounds before the night took them. They are all gone now, but they do not feel far. I carry them with me in the way I walk through the village, in the way I light the fire at dusk, in the way I pause when the church bell rings. Their memory is not loud. It does not cry out. It settles gently like ash upon a stone. I have seen the seasons pass, too many to count. I have watched children grow tall and strong, watched them run through the same fields we once tilled. They speak of far-off cities and places I once knew. Their voices are full of life. I listen and I nod and I smile, but I do not tell them everything. There are stories I have folded into the corners of my mind like old letters, worn thin, too fragile to unfold. Sometimes I walk the old road leading west, just until the trees close in again. The path has changed, narrowed, softened by moss and time. But I know its shape. My feet remember. I stop at a bend where a stream runs low over smooth stones. and I speak their names, one by one. I speak them not to summon them back, but to send them forward. To say, you were here, you walked, you were seen, and you are not forgotten. I do not know if anyone hears me, but I believe something does. Not the wind, not the trees, but something deeper. Something that was there when we knelt in the olive grove, when we whispered our last prayers in the shadow of the wall, when we crossed the sea with salt drying on our lips. Something that watched us walk through the fire and waited for us in the silence beyond. When I was young, I thought prayer was a matter of words. Now I know it is a matter of presence. To sit still, to remember, to hold space for what was and what remains. This is how I pray now. Not with folded hand, but with quiet, with breath, with the slow turning of memory, like pages worn smooth by time. Sometimes when I wake in the night, I light a small candle by my window. Not because I fear the dark, but because the light reminds me of their faces. And because I want them to know, if they are still out there, in some way I cannot understand, that there is someone who remembers, someone who carries their names like stones in a pocket, someone who still walks, still listens, still keeps watch. I have grown older than I expected. My back aches more often. My hands do not move as quickly, but my mind is clear, and my heart still makes room for the long road behind me, and for those who never return from its dust. This is my offering now, not sword, not banner, not song, but memory, soft as rain, steady as breath, sacred as silence, a prayer for the lost, and for all of us who walked beside them. Part 15, the end of the journey. It is evening as I write this. The sun has lowered itself behind the hills, and the sky has turned the color of old parchment. The fields beyond my window are quiet. The last of the birds have returned to their branches. The air holds the smell of the hearth, and somewhere in the distance a cowbell rings, then falls silent again. There is a stillness in this hour that I have come to love. It is not the stillness of sleep, nor the hush of fear. It is the stillness that comes when nothing more must be done, when the work is finished, when the light is soft and kind, when the heart no longer reaches outward, but settles gently where it is. I do not know how many years I have lived. I have stopped counting them. They move now like leaves in water, slipping past without urgency. I wake when the light wakes me. I sleep when the dark becomes complete. Each day is quiet. Each day is a gift. And still the road remains. It lives not beneath my feet, but within me, in the shape of my thoughts, in the way I notice the silence between footsteps, in the way I bow my head before speaking the names of those who are gone. I walk less now. My knees ache in the cold. My hands are stiff, but when I do walk, just to the edge of the village or through the tall grass beyond the stone fence, I feel the rhythm return. The rhythm of the march. One foot, then the next, not fast, not forced, just forward. There is a kind of peace that comes when one no longer searches for answers, when the questions themselves become companions, when you can sit beside them without needing to pull them apart. I have learned to do that, to sit in the company of memory without fear, to let the ache of what was become something gentle. I do not remember every face, not anymore, but I remember the way we moved together. I remember the sound of leather straps pulled tight, the creak of wooden carts, the way bread tasted after a hard climb, the look in a man's eyes when he knew he would not see another dawn, and yet still passed you his last flask of water. I remember the olive trees near Jerusalem. I remember the spring hidden in the hills. I remember the scent of sea salt in the wind, and the way stars reflected in the dark water. These memories rise like smoke, slow and curling. They do not sting, they do not burn. They simply remain. Sometimes, children from the village ask me what the crusade was like. what it meant to wear the cross, what it felt like to see the holy city. I tell them what I can, that the road was long, that the dust was deep, that the sun could turn the skin to leather, that hunger made every word holy. But mostly I tell them about the stillness. Not everyone returns from a journey whole. Some return in pieces, others never return at all, and a few come back carrying something they did not leave with. I came back with silence. It settled in me like a bird nesting in the rafters. At first, I tried to shake it loose, tried to speak over it, tried to return to the man I had been, but the silence remained. And over time, I came to see that it was not empty. It was full of the lives we touched, the prayers we offered, the choices we made. Full of dust and fire, yes, but also full of mercy, even if we did not know it at the time. The world now moves faster than it once did, or perhaps it is I who have slowed. The younger men build their homes with new tools. They speak of cities I have never seen. They laugh easily, and I am glad. They do not need to carry what we carry. But sometimes when they sit at my table and the candlelight softens their voices, I see the road in them. I see the longing, the quiet question that every heart asks in its own time. Where am I meant to walk? And why? And who will remember that I passed this way? When they ask, I do not give them answers. I only give them this. Walk gently, look often, listen more than you speak, carry little, share what you have, and when the night feels long, lift your eyes to the stars. You are never walking alone. I believe now that God does not meet us only in churches or chapels. He meets us in the road dust, in the cold stone of a mountain pass, in the face of a stranger offering bread, in the silence before a battle, and in the breath that follows grief. I used to wonder if I had done enough, if I had walked far enough, knelt deeply enough, prayed with sufficient fire. But the older I become, the more I believe that it was not the number of miles, nor the strength of the sword, nor even the memory of the city walls that mattered. It was the walk itself, the steady return of the foot to the earth, the pause before the next step, the quiet choice to rise again after falling. That is what remains. That is what matters. The journey never ends as we expect. It unfolds slowly, and if we are lucky, it does not lead us to victory, but to gentleness. To the kind of peace that does not shout, but waits, softly, until we are ready to sit beside it. There is a bench I built with my own hands. It rests beneath the tree where I buried my mother. Sometimes I sit there and speak aloud. I speak to those I have lost. To Alain, to Etienne, to Henri, to the ones whose names I never knew, but whose breath once warmed the same night air as mine. I tell them that I remember, that I have not forgotten the road, or the silence. I tell them that the fire they carried has not gone out, that I still walk, in small ways, in the garden, along the stream, between my waking and my sleep. And I tell them thank you. Thank you for walking beside me. Thank you for sharing the weight. Thank you for leaving behind a silence that taught me how to listen. One day soon, I will leave this place, not in haste, not in fear, but as I left before, gently, with dust on my boots, and a prayer beneath my breath, not for myself, but for those still walking, and for the one who walks with them, whether they know it or not. I will close my eyes, and in that moment, I believe the road will rise again beneath my feet. I will see the sun over the valley, the sea in the distance, the olive trees swaying in the wind, and the sound of quiet footsteps behind me. Not alone, not ever, because the road remembers, and I do too.